Thank you so much for having me here today. My first time in Arkansas. I'm thrilled to be here. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is quite dispiriting. So I wanted to start by telling you about something from earlier this year that's probably the most memorable scene of my reporting life to date. It happened on the 9th of January, and this was the first day of a week-long referendum in South Sudan, where the people of South Sudan were getting to vote on how they wanted to be governed, whether they wanted to become an independent nation. And it was a vote that came after the culmination of generations worth of struggle for self-determination. So I was there reporting for the Washington Post, and in a country where normally I'm one of, at most, a handful of foreign correspondents, suddenly the world media had descended for this vote. So I got out of the sort of craziness of that and headed into a very rural area in Bentiu, in a place called Unity State. And I wanted to see people going and casting their vote. So I went to the different polling stations on the first day. And I should say, to sort of give you a sense of the picture, there's very little infrastructure in South Sudan. There was very little to begin with, and what there was mostly bombed during the war. And so the first polling station that I was at was a church that had been really completely bombed out. I was there the first morning of voting, watching people cast their ballots. And there's a huge illiteracy rate in South Sudan. 85% of the population can't read or write. So it was a ballot that was done by a sign, whether you wanted unity or independence, and you marked your thumb on which side. So I finished at this one polling station at about midday. It's the dry season, very hot, like 110, 115 degrees. And I come out, and walking up towards the polling station, I can see this boy, maybe 8, 9 years old, pushing a wheelbarrow. Well, that's a little strange, not what you expect to see coming up to a polling station. I got a little bit closer and saw that inside the wheelbarrow was this woman writhing in pain. Her legs were wasted away and curled up beside her, and as I got closer, her family came over and explained what was happening. They said that she'd been sick for a very long time, but during the night something had happened and she had just started screaming and screaming. They were terrified that she was actually dying. But she wouldn't let them try to get her any kind of medical care until she'd first been able to go and cast her vote. And so she insisted that they put her in this rusty old wheelbarrow and drive her, pushing the wheelbarrow, to the polling station, and she was there to cast her vote. And it was just this sense of what it actually meant, the act of dignity, to be able to cast your vote for how you wanted to be governed. And that story was not unique. All around South Sudan, in the week of the 9th of January 2011, you had people who were terminally ill going to cast their vote for the future. And whilst this new country of South Sudan, 98.5% of people voted for independence, and it became an independent country on July 9th this year, while it has a huge amount of set of challenges before it, I never want to forget that image of just all these people coming to polling stations saying, no matter what happens in the future, it doesn't matter if I die tomorrow, I want to know that my people, my children, my grandchildren will get to have a say in how they govern their future. So while that was this incredible moment for the people of South Sudan, the other thing that was happening that day is I was getting text messages on my cell phone from people in the north of the country, people who didn't get to vote for self-determination, and people in particular in Darfur, the place that I want to talk about today. And the question is, what happens to Darfur, this place in the north of the country that was the inspiration for the hugest citizen movement in the US that we had seen since the apartheid era. This inspiring, unprecedented movement that led hundreds and thousands of Americans to rally to try to improve the lives of people in Darfur. And it was founded on the promise of what it could mean if regular citizens engaged in the foreign policy of their own country, to be upstanders instead of bystanders. It's a movement that I was very much involved in the formation of. And when I began writing this book, it was my hope that I would be narrating the first successful citizens' movement to stop genocide. Unfortunately, that's not the book that I got to write. And it would be a disservice to the hundreds of thousands of people that were killed in Darfur, as well as the millions that today remain in displaced camps, to tell it any other way. But what I don't want this to be seen as is a story of failure where you say, well, there was not the gold standard of success, and so the answer is to give up and walk away and not try again. That's the wrong message to take from this. The message is to say this is a story of opportunity. There was this amazing movement that did unprecedented things. A lot of them need to be replicated in the future. A lot of them also didn't work and need to be done better in the future. How do we look at that and move it forward? But to get into all that, what I want to start with is some history, because you can't understand the downsides of this movement unless you understand a little bit more about Sudan itself. And it is a country that I think is one of the most beautiful and certainly fascinating in the world. So I hope you'll be willing to go with me into a little bit of its history. I think one of the easiest ways to start to get a sense of the many different conflicts in Sudan is by looking at a map of the old unified Sudan. And if you saw that map, you would see that the unified Sudan was surrounded by 9 different countries, stretching from Egypt and Libya in the north, very much part of the Arab world, down to Uganda, Kenya, Congo in the south, very much part of East Africa. And so there's been this question hanging over the Sudanese people: what does it mean to be Sudanese? Does it mean that you're Arab? Does it mean that you're African? Are either of these terms any use at all? A lot of Sudanese will say, no, we reject either category. But this has been a constant source of tension in Sudan. And during the British colonial period, the British ruled Sudan as if it were already 2 different countries. As early as 1922, so almost 90 years before the modern-day split of Sudan that we saw this year, you had to have a physical travel permit to cross between the south of Sudan and the north of Sudan. The British ruled the country from Khartoum in the north, and they really didn't get down into the south of the country. It was physically quite difficult to move down that far, and so they outsourced the services that the state should have been provided to British missionaries. British missionaries came into the south, taught the local population to speak English, made a lot of conversions to Christianity. Now, the British had been thinking about partitioning the country. What happened, though, was you had this wave of independence movements across Africa in the 1950s. The British had to get out pretty quickly, and when they did, they handed control over to people in the north, who rapidly set about defining Sudan as an Arab and Islamic nation. Now imagine if you were the people in the south who had, by this point, had decades of rule, creating a sense of them as an English-speaking Christian state grounded in East Africa, to suddenly be told that you were part of an Arab Islamic state. It's the perfect set of conditions for civil war, and that's exactly what happened the minute that the British left. So you had the first Sudanese civil war starting in 1956, went through to 72, there was a peace agreement, that broke down, war resumed again in 1983. In 1989, the current Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, took power in a military coup, and the war against the south intensified even further. One of the tactics that the North used against the South, and it's something that we would see later in Darfur, was to use proxy militia. They worked out that it was cheaper and more effective than having the Sudanese army itself kill people in the south, was to try to get Southerners killing each other. The south, like every other part of Sudan, is very diverse, and there were a lot of disputes over land. The government found that if you gave one group suddenly so much better weaponry than their neighbours that they were having a land dispute with, you could lead to Southerners killing Southerners. So as a result of that, in addition to the traditional warfare between North and South, the Second Sudanese Civil War killed 2 million people. And I always want to stop over that 2 million, because I don't know about you, but for me as a human being, I just can't get my head around that number. What does it mean for 2 million people to die in a war? The only way that I can make sense of it in human terms is to say to you that over the last 7 years of interviews with people in South Sudan, I am yet to meet a single person who hasn't had an immediate family member killed in that war. You can think about what that trauma means on a family level, but when you think about what it means at a community level, that is a truly war-devastated community and now new country. But that war was brought to an end by a peace agreement, which started gaining traction in around 2001, 2002, and was signed in 2005, bringing an end to that war. That peace agreement set up a system where there would be a transition period between the signing of the agreement in 2005 and the referendum that we had in January this year. What was supposed to happen over that 6-year period was the democratic transformation of Sudan, so that by the time the people of South Sudan got to vote, they were voting between an independent South Sudan and a truly democratic Sudan as a whole. That democratic transformation never happened, in large part because of the huge shift of attention over to atrocities that began to happen in Darfur. The other thing that the peace agreement did was to set up a new system for wealth sharing in Sudan. And as we start to talk about Darfur, there's another lens to add into to try to understand about the different conflicts in Darfur, and that's not a conflict over identity, but a conflict over resources. For the longest of times, people who have ruled the state from Khartoum have monopolized what is a huge amount of wealth in Sudan. Sudan has a huge amount of oil resources, and they've monopolized it in Khartoum. So you will literally have skyscrapers and world-class hotels in Khartoum. Meanwhile, the south of the country, Darfur, the east of the country, doesn't have paved roads, electricity, basic schooling. And the people who control the state send their kids to private schools in the UK and the US, while people in the rest of the country, there are no schools for their children to go to. The peace agreement was supposed to set up a new deal for dividing wealth in the country, but it was doing it between the government in the north and the south. Now, what about the rest of the people in the north, people in Darfur, who also were facing the same kind of marginalization, who started saying, wait, what about us? As we head into Darfur, it's worth going back a little bit in time there too, to at least the 1980s. In the 1980s, those of you who are old enough in the room will remember you had Geldof and Band-Aid doing a lot of mobilizing and advocacy around what was happening in Ethiopia with drought and famine. Exactly those same dynamics were killing people in Darfur at that time. You had drought, you had desertification, you had a huge squeeze on the land use. People in Darfur use land in different ways depending on their different types of livelihoods. And those livelihoods coalesce around ethnic lines. So Arabs are more likely to be nomads, non-Arabs are more likely to be farmers. It's not a hard and fast rule, there's some interchange between the two. But those are the basic forms of land use. Now, as land use gets squeezed because of drought and desertification, there's increasing tensions over how you use that land. Traditionally, those disputes over land were resolved through conflict resolution mechanisms just between these different ethnic groups. What happened in the 1980s, though, were two things. One, you had Colonel Gaddafi, who we have this morning learned was killed in Libya. You had him in the 1980s building this pan-Arab ideology, saying to the Arab groups in Darfur, it's not good enough that you just have agreements with your non-Arab neighbours to use the land. You actually have to have ownership of the land. He wanted to create a pan-Arab belt across Africa. So you had this ideology combined with, as a result of the Cold War, suddenly this influx of modern weaponry onto the African continent. And so disputes over land that before would be resolved by relatively low-tech means if there was any fighting, suddenly were being fought out with automatic weapons. So the whole thing started to become more deadly. It became infused with this ideology, and then the clincher was that you had the government starting to intervene on behalf of one side, on behalf of the Arab groups in the region. So all that was being set up for the kinds of dynamics that eventually led to what we saw in 2003, 2004, 2005. Darfur as a whole, though, regardless of what was happening inside it, was being marginalised by Khartoum. And so in 2002, when the peace agreement between North and South was looking like it was actually going somewhere, when it was looking like people in the South were going to get a fair share in the wealth and resources that Khartoum had been monopolising, people in Darfur started saying, what about us? We need a share in that agreement as well. Now, the government sitting in Khartoum was in no way going to have a part of this. They were not going to bring the people of Darfur into that agreement. They knew that if they let people in Darfur in, they would have claims from other people who were marginalised in the north, people in the Nuba Mountains, people in the east of the country. And so they decided to send a very strong message. We will quash this rebellion militarily. And that's what they set about doing, using many of the techniques that they had perfected in the long war against the South. In particular, the use of proxy militia, people that we came to know as the Janjaweed, who were in fact these groups of Arabs, nomads, that were landless, and who, while previously had got on with their neighbours and worked out different types of agreement over land use, now felt that they actually needed to own the land. And the government said to them that if they cleared these non-Arab groups off the land, they could own that land. You had, by 2002, the beginning of 2003, the worst of atrocities that Darfur had ever seen. And for those of you who are following it, there was a very clear pattern. The government would coordinate these air-land assaults. So the government would come over, drop bombs on villages, but would have coordinated to have the Janjaweed encircling the village. So as people tried to flee these burning huts, the Janjaweed were there to entrap them, to stop them escaping. It was also a gendered policy. On the whole, men were killed, and not just men, babies, 2 days old. Sons were thrown into burning huts, with mothers being told that they were killing these children because they could grow up to become rebels. Women were often killed, but more often than that were raped, because it's a patrilineal system in Darfur, and so rape was as effective as killing a woman at changing the demography. Because the children that were born of the Janjaweed would grow up to be quote-unquote Arab children. While all of this was happening, if you looked and do a survey of the mainstream media in 2003, you see that there is not one single mainstream media report of what is happening, not one. You can do it, I've done this. What you have is, in the New York Times, their World in Brief section, those little paragraphs that they have, there's sort of a half a sentence reference to fighting in Darfur. The Western media missed it completely. Was that because there was no information about what was happening? No. Human rights organisations knew about it. Diaspora groups knew about it. Part of the problem was, though, that the media felt they knew the story. The story of Sudan was the story of the end to a civil war that had killed 2 million people. Finally, a peace agreement to end the longest-running civil war in Africa. Finally, a good news story coming out of Africa. So they were telling the North-South story. And it was difficult to work out, unless you were sort of immersed in the history of Sudan, how this rebellion and then atrocities in Darfur fitted into that very nice story of success. Something similar was happening on the policy side. If you speak to the people who were, for the US government, posted in Khartoum at that time, they knew what was happening. There are memos that I've had declassified saying, if we don't do something about what is happening in Darfur, thousands of people are going to die. The message that they got back from Washington was, quote, "Don't rock the boat," unquote. What it meant was we need to first finish this North-South peace agreement before we can deal with what is happening in Darfur. The North-South peace agreement was a sort of once-in-a-generation diplomatic coup to be able to end the longest-running civil war in Africa. And it was felt that if you raised with the Sudanese government the atrocities in Darfur, it would undermine the peace agreement between North and South. And so for all of 2003, while these horrific crimes were underway, you're really not seeing it being covered. You're not seeing it talked about in the highest levels of government, and you're not seeing it being talked about in the media. What we also know, though, is that at some point that changed. At some point, Darfur became the Sudan story in the media. How did that happen? Well, it wasn't by chance. It was because a group of human rights, well, not so much a group, individual human rights advocates who knew what was happening, who were frustrated that it wasn't getting traction, looked for a way to get a media hook that would sell this story. And they found it in April of 2004. April of 2004 was the 10th anniversary of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. At the time, people had paid very little attention. 10 years on, there were global commemorations and hand-wringing over the fact that the West had failed to intervene in Rwanda. And so people started writing op-eds saying, now is the moment to stop another Rwanda happening. Look at Darfur, it is Rwanda just 10 years later. And it was incredibly effective as a media hook. Suddenly Darfur, a year, 18 months after the crisis had started, hit the mainstream media. This was also the frame through which most of us, the public, who were soon to become advocates, learned about Darfur. We learned about Darfur not as a place that was related to all these other conflicts that were happening in Sudan, but we learned about Darfur as a place we understood by analogy to Rwanda. Rwanda, where in 1994, more than 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu had been killed while the US government under the Clinton administration had denied the reality of what was happening and refused to call it genocide because the lawyers in that administration believed that if you called it genocide, there would be a legal obligation to actually do something. Now, if you fast forward to 2004, people hearing about this for the first time started thinking, okay, we need to push the government to do something. And they got a real boost in September of 2004 when Colin Powell became the first member of the executive branch of the government to formally say what is happening is genocide in Darfur. The first time that a government had said this whilst the violence was ongoing. Congress had said it in the summer, but it was the first time that the executive branch had done it. Knowing the history of Rwanda, you might think, what a momentous decision. Surely this means that the US government has decided that in the face of what looks like genocide, they're going to actually do something. Unfortunately, when you go and interview Colin Powell and the other people involved, it's somewhat a different story. Powell was, by that point, extremely isolated within the Bush administration. And he had gone to see President Bush on the Tuesday, just 2 days before he made his public determination, which was on the Thursday, the 9th of September. On the Tuesday, he goes to see the president. Mr. Bush, by the way, on Thursday, I'll be saying that Darfur is genocide. And President Bush says to Condoleezza Rice, well, you'd better let the heads of the other agencies know so they're not surprised. In no way was this a whole of government decision, commitment to actually do something. Knowing that, you then ask Colin Powell, well, what did you think you would achieve by saying this was genocide? And he says, I hoped that it would encourage other countries on the UN Security Council to act. Great idea in theory, major miscalculation in practice for the man who had 18 months before just stood before the UN Security Council and said, there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And so what he hoped would be this catalyzing call to the international community ended up being exactly the opposite. You had all the other countries in the world deeply skeptical about calling Darfur genocide because the US had gone out and said that it was. What he and no other member of the Bush administration expected, though, was that it would be a catalyzing call for ordinary US citizens. And they were the ones who took this up and moved it forward. And you had the beginnings of this amazing citizens movement. What did the citizens movement achieve? Firstly, they introduced accountability for crimes against humanity, war crimes, mass atrocities, genocide into the US Congress for the first time in history. And this was a coalition that was driven by students, but it ended up bringing a whole lot of other different groups on board. And the way that they got accountability into the Congress was doing something freakishly simple, something that domestic lobby groups had known how to do for decades, something the NRA had perfected many years before. Issuing scorecards, grading every member of Congress on how they were responding to Darfur, from A+ to F. And this was an initiative of the Genocide Intervention Network, run by students who had literally just graduated college. Within a very short amount of time of issuing these cards, they got responses. And they got responses not just from the staffers of Congress people, but from senators themselves, literally senators calling the offices manned by these recently graduated college students saying, I've got high schoolers in my district who are screaming at me because I got a C+ on my report card. Can you please just tell me what I have to do to get a better grade? So a huge amount of impact in a very short space of time by doing something really quite straightforward. The other thing that they did was have a huge impact on the amount of funding that went to the crisis in Darfur. And you talk to the Africa hands in Congress who just look in bewilderment at what happened, because they're used to having your sort of elite human rights groups go to them and say, well, what do you need for humanitarian aid in country X? And they'll say, you know, we need this amount, and they'll go to Congress, and by the time it gets through the system, they end up with sort of half. What was happening on Darfur was that you had the advocates go and say, what do you need? And Congress would come back with more than what had been asked for. And it wasn't because the needs in Darfur were that much more than any other crisis in Africa, but it was because you had a mass movement backing up the request. Instead of saying there are huge human rights needs, huge humanitarian needs, and it would really be the right thing for you to do to appropriate this funding, you could say all of that, plus you had the stick in hand of, by the way, if you don't do that, then we're going to have voters in your district raising hell. So again, huge impact just by having mobilized citizens around this issue. Thirdly, impact on the media. You know this from just sort of intuition that too often the media will cover a crisis when it hits, and then within 2 or 3 weeks, they've moved on to the next crisis du jour. We saw it happen in Egypt this year. We've seen it happen in many different occasions. And it usually happens when it comes to mass atrocity crimes. What having the citizen movement did was it kept Darfur on the agenda for an extraordinary amount of time. Darfur coverage was 50% greater 3 years into the crisis than it was when it first broke through in April of 2004, 50% greater. And that was because you had citizen advocates who were calling the media every time that they did a story on Sudan saying, "Thank you for covering this, and we want to see more." And as a journalist, you're always fighting for space in the paper. You're having to sell to your editor why it is that you should get that piece of the Foreign Affairs page. And the editor takes their cue from what they're hearing from the public. So when you have the public calling and saying, "We want to see this covered," that's going to give the space to it. All of these are incredible accomplishments. Question is, though, what did it actually mean for Darfur? And that's a question that at a certain point in time, people started forgetting to ask, which is not something that I say lightly because everybody who was involved was hugely committed to Darfur. But they stopped asking that question because they assumed that if they did everything that they had been told we needed to do during the genocide in Rwanda, then Darfur would be saved. In other words, everybody was fighting the last war. The lessons learned that were written after Rwanda were written at a very particular point in time. It was the end of the Cold War and before the invasion of Iraq. So real peak in terms of US hard and soft power, and a belief that if the US went out in front and led on an issue like this, then the rest of the world would rally round. Pretty much the theory that Colin Powell was working on. But in the intervening decades, so much had changed in the world that those lessons had started to become out of date. Now, in some instances, this didn't matter at all. The funding, for instance. It didn't matter what was the position of the US relative to everybody else in the world. That funding still got through to the people in Darfur. $2 billion worth of funding between 2005 and 2008. To put that in context, that was second only to Iraq and Afghanistan, tenfold more than any other African country. But in terms of changing the fundamentals on the ground in Darfur, having the US being the one that was going out and leading on this issue was not going to get you where you needed to go. Because if you took a really hard look at US leverage, US didn't have a whole lot going for it. It did, before the invasion of Iraq, have the stick in hand of, military force. But after Iraq became a quagmire, it became very clear to the leadership in Khartoum that the US was simply not going to get engaged. So you didn't have that stick. But because you had a constituency who were so furious, rightly, at this genocidal government, you also didn't have any carrots in hand. You had had sanctions, the US had had sanctions against Sudan ever since it originally hosted Osama bin Laden back in the 1990s. Only after Sudan chucked out bin Laden did he head over to Afghanistan and ultimately Pakistan. So the US already had the maximum of what it could do in terms of economic sanctions against Sudan. So in terms of sticks, you no longer had a credible threat of military force, and there was very little that you could do in terms of further sanctions. The only thing that you were left with was carrots, offering we could lift those sanctions, and who wants to do that against a government that is committing these atrocities? The country that had the real leverage was China. China is the largest investor in the Sudanese oil industry, and it also has veto power on the UN Security Council. People on the Security Council started calling China a heat shield. Any time that Western nations wanted to pressure Sudan, China would threaten the use of its veto. And for the longest time within this advocacy community that was trying really hard to learn the lessons of Rwanda, it wasn't looking to China, it was focused on Washington. But what you had a few years down the track was a group of people led in fact by a man called Eric Reeves and a woman by the name of Mia Farrow, who said, I think China is actually the country that we need to be looking at. And they threw out all the conventional wisdom on China. The conventional wisdom, if you talk to any China expert, is that Chinese foreign policy cannot be moved in confrontational terms. If you want to talk to China, you need to do it gently, quietly, respectfully, behind the scenes. They threw all that out, and they launched a campaign called the Genocide Olympics. They couldn't have been less nuanced or sophisticated. And they went out there into the public. And they understood that they probably couldn't get China to really care about human rights in Darfur, but that they had a unique window of leverage in the build-up to the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing, a period where China very much cared about its own international image and reputation, and that if they could make strides at shaming that image, then maybe they could get China to shift. Within the first day of the campaign being launched, China created for the first time a position of a Darfur special envoy. Now, creating a special envoy doesn't necessarily mean they're doing anything, but it means you've got their attention. What was fascinating to see, though, was over the course of the year-long campaign, China did a 180-degree reversal at the Security Council on its approach to having peacekeepers in Darfur, from refusing it to actually supporting the deployment of peacekeepers. So it was just a really interesting example of what can happen when you throw out the conventional wisdom, look beyond the targets that everybody else is talking about, and saying, I think we should give this a try. I think a huge source of potential opportunity for people who are thinking about how to move human rights situations in the future, particularly as we see the rise not only of China, but of this Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS bloc. There needs to be a lot more thinking about how to engage with those countries. And doing the public shaming is not always going to work. It worked because you had this particularly unique moment. But there have to be other ways of thinking about how to mobilize around these issues. There were costs that came with the mass movement approach. The benefits are clear. You could get accountability into Congress. You could get funding beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The costs, though, were that to get a mass movement, you have to, by definition, reach people who are not already experts in the issue. If you don't do that, then you don't have a mass movement, you have an elite movement. But to reach people who don't have a background, you're going to have to simplify your story. And so it meant that a lot of the people who came into the Darfur movement came into it through this hook of, oh, it's like that Rwanda story. Instead of knowing about the history of Darfur and its relationship to everything else that was happening in Sudan. And that ended up having a lot of negative consequences, particularly when it became clear that the North-South peace agreement was starting to fall apart. Leaders within the movement saw that and wanted to draw attention to it, but it meant they had to do a whole lot of education to shift the mass movement around to caring about what was happening in other parts of Sudan in addition to Darfur. They started trying to do that work in 2008. It really took them until 2010, 2 years to really get a change of message. One of the costs of going for a mass movement approach. The other cost is that to keep a mass movement engaged, they need to feel successful. If you're asking people, we're not talking about professional human rights advocates here, you're talking about people who are volunteering their time. And so they're already busy with family and with work. You can't say to them, you know, thanks for picking up the kids late and missing that deadline at work for doing the Darfur advocacy, you achieved nothing today. And yet, for long stretches of time, when you're talking about really difficult problems, that's actually going to be the case. And the risk, and this was a risk that the movement started to fall into, is that to try to sustain the vitality of the movement, you create quick win successes. So suddenly success becomes, congratulations, we sent 500,000 emails to the Assistant Secretary of State today. Now that could be an intermediate step of success. The question is, are you losing sight of what is the true metric of success? Can Darfuris safely return to their homes? It was an issue for the Darfur movement. I think you'll see it becoming an issue for the movements that we're seeing around this country with the Tea Party, with Occupy Wall Street, and potentially in Libya as well. Having had the victory, Egypt also, having had the immediate victory, how do you sustain that momentum when things get really, really difficult? So, having said all of that, question is, how long since you've seen an article about Darfur? a year, more than a year. Is that because everything is fine in Darfur? Not at all. It's because the spotlight has again shifted to other parts of Sudan. So you remember in 2003, nobody was covering Darfur because everybody was focusing on this North-South peace agreement. Then what happened in 2010 and earlier this year, the attention shifted away from Darfur again, back to South Sudan. Meanwhile, the Sudanese government is making the most of that. They haven't issued any visas for journalists to get into Darfur. The brave Sudanese journalists who were trying to still cover it were detained, and a number of them are still in incommunicado detention in Khartoum. So Darfur has just become this black hole. We're not getting information, and because we're not getting information, you're not seeing the public talking about this issue again. And I think the frustration for so many people in Sudan is that we keep looking at different parts of their country so narrowly. It's like spotlight here, and they say what we need is the floodlights on the whole country, seeing how these issues are interconnected. So while it's a very mixed story, like I said at the beginning, I don't want this story to be one that says fail and walk away, because there are real lives still at stake. And what we know about our political system is that sometimes it can do the right and moral thing, but its status quo is towards not acting to save the lives of people in other countries unless there is a vital national security interest at stake. That's a status quo position. Given that, we know that the only way to shift that status quo, one of the only ways to shift the status quo, is if citizens, ordinary people, a mass movement, pushes the government in a different direction. Now, they need to do it smarter than was done on Darfur. They need to look at other targets besides just the US government. But that basic instinct that citizens themselves can shift foreign policy away from a calculation that says we only care about you if there's a national security interest involved, that basic instinct is the right one, and it's the one that needs to be fostered. Without it, I believe that there is no hope for ending genocide and mass atrocities. And it's not just about hope for ending these sorts of crimes. It's also about hope for the victims and survivors. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with Darfuris over the years, people who have been forced to flee their homes, whose lives as they've known them have been completely decimated, who will say that despite all clearly massive failings, the one thing that has enabled them to sustain some sense of hope is to know that somewhere out there on the other side of the world, people who they will probably never meet know what was happening and care about it. And so I think that whilst it can seem like a huge and impossible problem, and we stumble and we fail and we get it wrong, even in getting it wrong, we are doing something towards the right end goal. And so I just leave you with that, and would like you to ask me any questions you feel like asking. Thank you.
All right, we do have time for some questions. Maggie, you have one right here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Maggie Carroll. I go to school here, and thank you so much for coming. You discussed earlier that in 2002 and 2003, the media coverage was almost non-existent, and that it took another citizens movement to resurrect that. For places like Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and then I'm assuming later Libya, will it take the same thing? Do you see the same sort of citizen movement happening? Where do you see that going?
I mean, what is exciting about what we're seeing in the Arab world right now is citizen movements inside those countries. And you know, that would be the far better result in Sudan, where it's possible, where that can be fostered locally, then you don't run into so many of the problems that you have when it is outsiders who are doing the advocacy. But it's not a one or the other kind of situation. There's room for both because both can play different roles. And this is where, for example, the story of how successful advocates were in attracting the attention of the media to stay on the story, that's a role that US citizens can and should be playing on situations like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia. Really very simple to do, just that message of getting ordinary citizens to write letters to the editor whenever the story is being covered saying, thank you, we appreciate this, we want to see more of it. The message gets through to the editors. And so it's not replacing the sorts of on-the-ground citizens movements that you're having in these countries. It's just playing a different role. Citizens can play it, they can play it relatively easily, and I think they absolutely should.
Yes, question right here, this lady right here, Bob, and then we'll get to you.
Thank you so much for coming again, Beck. I have a question on divestment and its kind of effectiveness. Can you talk about the university and the state and local divestments from Sinopec and PetroChina and how that affected China?
Yeah, so a little background. I was very involved in starting this divestment campaign, which is, to go back a little bit, as I said, there were huge US economic sanctions on Sudan, so the US government and US businesses couldn't directly still can't do directly business with the Sudanese government, but there was a connection to the US because a lot of, say, people with retirement plans had stocks in companies traded on the New York Stock Exchange that were working in China, and in particular, working in Sudan, in particular the Chinese oil companies. So the idea of a divestment campaign was to pull money out of these companies and to send the message, either you stop doing business with the Sudanese government because doing business with them is increasing their military budget, enabling them to conduct these atrocities in Darfur, or you risk losing your reputation and share value in the US market. That was the instinct behind a divestment campaign. What was great about it was that it made an issue that was very far away seem local to people. You could go to shareholders' meetings, you could go to pension fund meetings, and people could think, actually, that's my money that is being used to perpetrate atrocities in Sudan. The movement became more sophisticated over time. We started it on the campuses because a lot of the university endowments had investments in these corporations, and it spread to state legislatures and eventually to federal legislation. And it was a good educating tool, I think, about the role of China. I think had you not had the divestment movement, you wouldn't have got to the point where you had a genocide Olympics campaign focused on China. It started to draw those connections for people in a very real way. The amount itself, the sort of objective amount that was divested from these corporations, was not enough to lead them to withdraw from Sudan or to have a really huge effect on what was happening in terms of the Sudanese budget. But I think that it's narrow to measure it on that metric of success alone. And the divestment campaign became more sophisticated over time. Initially, the thinking was, to put the demand to PetroChina, either you stop doing business with the Sudanese government or, we create all this muckraking around your reputation and shares. Over time, as it became more sophisticated, it was the thinking of, well, here's a company that actually has contacts with the very highest levels of the Sudanese government. Perhaps we could get them having conversations about how to change their behavior. So a constructive engagement approach. And what has stemmed out of that is, I'm blanking on the name, Conflict Risk Network. Now, a lot of the students who started the divestment movement became more sophisticated, learned more about financial markets, have started this conflict risk network that is now looking at situations at risk of conflict all around the world and advising global companies on how to shield themselves from the risk of being targeted by a sort of citizens movement that raises concerns about human rights policies. Trying to get in preemptively and say, if you don't want to get into this sort of hot water, here are the sorts of conversations that you need to be having with the government around human rights. So I think it's moving in a very positive direction in ways that we could have never foreseen when we were starting our little campaign to get Harvard to divest.
I think there's no question among most Americans that our Rwanda policy was a failure. I think you just talk about the success with Darfur in Congress, but I believe on the executive level, it's been a failure. So the U.S. definitely has a greater responsibility. We should be doing more. I'll start with that and say that. But my question really is about the British government. What has been their response? What have they been doing? It is a former British colony. You touched on how really them pulling out started this whole thing. So what has been the response with the British government?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they were the only, them pulling out was not the only factor. There was a whole history before that. But yes, certainly they have a particular responsibility as the former colonial power. And let me just, before I get directly to your question, say, Congress have responded to the demands of citizens. But number one, the demands of citizens haven't always been right. I mean, I think there's a question over whether at certain points it might have been useful to be able to offer Khartoum these carrots, but that was never going to fly within a sort of moral constituency, and I think for good reasons, but there's questions over it. And the executive failure is also, it's not a Rwanda-like failure. It's not a lack of engagement, lack of will issue. It is to a certain extent. Darfur was never at the top of the list of things. If the Bush administration went and had a discussion with China, Darfur might be on the list of talking points, but it was number 4. And that sends a signal about how important it is. Other things got prioritized. But the challenge with Darfur, the ongoing challenge with Sudan, is this question of who has the leverage. And Sudan has already weathered decades of the most sanctions that the US could throw at it, now indictment of its president by the International Criminal Court, and it's being able to weather it by support from the Arab League, from the Gulf states, from China, from India, from Malaysia and its oil section. And so it's not just about what the US does, and the UK is in a similar boat in that sense. They are necessary but not sufficient. And the question is, what are they going to do to try to move the other levers in the system that do have more direct leverage over Sudan? Are they really prioritizing it in their conversations with India, with China? As opposed to something that I think initially advocates were getting trapped into, which is having the UK or the US go out and make big public statements on Sudan. That, if anything, was being used by the regime in Khartoum for their own domestic benefit. They were saying, see, the West wants to colonize us again. And they were spinning that in the Arab world as, look, the US wants to invade another Muslim country. The more effective and more difficult route is to have these behind-the-scenes conversations, to put the multilateral pieces in place to actually have an impact. And the UK really stepped up to the plate when it came to the petition of Sudan. In fact, everybody did when it came to salvaging the referendum. So many parts of this North-South peace agreement had gone by the wayside. The democratic transformation never happened. And then everybody sort of rallied just for the final piece of it, which was the referendum, which went off more successfully than anyone had imagined. Huge role now for the international community in continuing to support this fledgling new nation of South Sudan to actually survive, and how to do that whilst not forgetting that you have the remainder of people in the rest of the country that are not getting the opportunity to try for a self-governing system, that are still under this military dictatorship.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Rebecca Hamilton for